Okay, so welcome everyone. So our guest speaker today is John Vincent. You already read his bio in advance of class, so you already know that John Vincent was an entrepreneur in the US during the early days of the PC industry. He founded a company that he later sold to a Fortune 500 company in the US. And he has since then pursued interest in sailing, biking, architecture, astronomical research at the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory, and he also interests in philosophy as a member of the Ayn Rand Institute's intellectual network. John has a vast experience in entrepreneurship as an angel venture capitalist, as well as a mentor to entrepreneurs in British Columbia. Indeed, he was the past coordinator for Viatech's mentor group for the Accelerate Tectoria's entrepreneurs in Victoria. And at the University of Victoria, John was a founding member of the management group of the Innovation Center for Entrepreneurs. And I know that some of you are already connected to this center, which is great. John also continues as a judge and advisor to the students of the Gustavson School of Business's Entrepreneurship Specialization Program, and that's you. And you will actually likely and hopefully see John as one of the judges in your final presentations as part of a panel of judges. In recent years, John has begun to write and lecture on the application of philosophical and business ethical principles to the successful practice of entrepreneurship, all of this drawing from his 45 years of experience in this field, so very impressive background. The topic of today's class or today's lecture is social entrepreneurship and ethics in entrepreneurship. So without further ado, please join me in giving John a warm welcoming to our class.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that kind introduction. I'm so pleased to be able to speak to so many young men and women who aspire to become successful entrepreneurs. You know, to me, in my pursuits, entrepreneurship was a very heroic pursuit and requires you to constantly challenge a lot of your thinking about the world on a continuous basis. I suspect this lecture might, in fact, challenge some of you. So with that, I hope you'll at least give yourself the freedom to consider the ideas, and if they find any validity by your reasoning, hopefully they will help you to succeed. So with that, let's begin. So normally one associates entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship with companies established as for-profit enterprises. Of course, for-profit enterprises deliver a lot of products and services which we use on a daily basis, you know, for the purposes of maximizing profits. For these enterprises, serving society is a means to an end, not necessarily an end in itself. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have nonprofit organizations formed primarily to serve some social or charitable purpose. A new classification, however, has arisen, which we're all partly here about, the social enterprise, which obviously is somewhere along that spectrum. Yet, how do we define this? I've found many numerous definitions of it over the years from reading and following this, but it's somewhat difficult to determine exactly what that means, I've found. Here we have actually one definition, which isn't too bad, by the Canadian Financial Post. We are all here Canadians. So they claim traditional businesses just need to prove that they are financially sound. Traditional charities need to prove that they are generating social impact. But social enterprises need to do both. Now, this definition obviously attempts to blend this concept of profits and social benefits for the purpose of generating a social impact, as they claim, which obviously puts it somewhere in between the spectrum. It's not a bad definition, but it seems to lack a little bit about why you would want to do that and how to do, which of course I want to address in this. I mean, to begin with, the concept of a positive impact is obviously one you quite often hear, and I often hear social entrepreneurs express as the reason why they want to create a social enterprise in the first place. You know, however, you know, frankly, for-profit businesses and nonprofit organizations also strive, would claim to strive, to have a positive impact on the world. So this concept of positive impact seems somewhat insufficient to differentiate themselves from them. I would also add what constitutes a positive impact is also a bit ambiguous. And who gets to decide what a positive impact is? And again, the question I've always asked, why? So let's move on to another concept, which I know you've all been introduced to because one of you even forwarded a question to me. A concept introduced by John Elkington in 1994, who was a business management and sustainability advocate, the triple bottom line. Of course, triple bottom line attempts to measure success of a company, not just by profits, but of course, people and planets. Now, how a company measures its profits, which I'm sure as business students you've already studied, is a relatively objective accounting principle. Yet how one measures a company's success in regards to people and the planet is a rather subjective, personal one in many regards. So again, this isn't, in my mind, sufficient to help you decide how and why to become social entrepreneurs. So let's talk to a few experts on different ends of the opinion about this. Our favorite friend, Bill Gates, somebody in the industry that I knew well. Consider these two notable individuals. You know, for example, Bill Gates obviously is a very successful businessman and with the Gates Foundation, a very successful philanthropist. He himself invests in many social enterprises. But he claims his motivation for doing it is as follows. He says, I believe with great wealth comes great responsibility. A responsibility to give back to society and a responsibility to see that those resources are put to work in the best possible way to help those most in need. Okay, that's one end of the spectrum, but Milton Friedman, who oddly is a Nobel Prize winning economist, has his sentiments that are rather on the opposite end of the spectrum. He would say there's only one and only one social responsibility of business is to use its resources, engage in activities designed to increase its profits. Now, obviously, with such successful and prominent people as Bill Gates and Milton Friedman describing as such polar views, and I haven't found any universally, generally accepted definition of social entrepreneurship as it's still being defined. It's no surprise to me that entrepreneurs such as yourself, who want to be, find it difficult deciding whether a social enterprise is in fact the best structure for achieving your desired purposes versus, let's say, a traditional for-profit or nonprofit. But let me just state, I think a social enterprise can be successful if properly defined and the challenges properly understood, which is what I'm going to be covering here. But to do so, I'd like to begin by at least throwing out my nickel into the fire with my definition of it, which you're going to see elaborated on quite a lot in this essay, this lecture. To me, a social enterprise is an organization willing to forfeit profitability or competitive pricing to some degree to provide additional social benefits, complementing their primary product offering to enhance the value of their enterprise. Now, notice that I use the word forfeit in my definition, not sacrifice. My definition implies this very important distinction between the two that we're going to elaborate on a lot in this lecture. A distinction between a forfeit for something one values versus a sacrifice of something one values. Forfeiting for something of value to achieve something of greater value is commonplace. I did it in my business, most people do that. Entrepreneurs forfeit a great deal of time and money. Why? To establish their enterprise and produce valuable products to generate profits. This is not a sacrifice, obviously. However, this is distinct from the concept of sacrificing something of value, such as perhaps compromising your product or limiting profitability to serve or achieve a social benefit. This really is a sacrifice, and it's important to differentiate the two throughout this lecture. Therefore, really the first challenge, as we start talking about the challenges, is really a business ethical challenge. It's a challenge based on ethics, which is a philosophy, obviously, a branch of philosophy. So we want to dig just briefly into this. We're not going to get into deep philosophical concepts, but to understand this difference, let's look at the origins. The origin of the concept of sacrificing oneself to others is embodied in the ethics of altruism, a word I'm sure you've all heard. but you may not know who formulated it. It's formulated and delineated by Auguste Comte in the 1800s. He professes that the most virtuous thing for a person to do is, in fact, to sacrifice self to others. On the other end of the spectrum, you notice that I was introduced as an intellectual from the Ayn Rand Institute, so you'll see a lot of this, is the ethics of individualism, the pursuit of one's own rational interest. Ayn Rand would claim that is, in fact, the most virtuous. Now, this obviously can represent a serious ethical challenge for you as a social entrepreneur. Altruism, on the one hand, professes the sacrifice of something of value to oneself to others as being virtuous and in attempts to claim the higher moral ground for doing so. Individualism professes productive achievement in pursuit of one's own rational interests as being virtuous. It's important to note that altruism and individualism are philosophical opposites that cannot be reconciled. I'm not fond of deep dive into philosophy. What's important here is that a common thread I find often conceptually underpinning social entrepreneurship, never explicitly stated, but often implied, is the concept of sacrifice. Many proponents of social entrepreneurship profess that the purpose of business, particularly a social enterprise, is to sacrifice itself to serve society or some other social benefit. Now, let's look at for-profit and non-profit companies in this regard. It's noticed that neither for-profit nor non-profit enterprises actually ascribe to the concept of sacrifice. A for-profit company does not sacrifice profitability to provide an unrelated social benefit, and even a non-profit organization does not sacrifice its social benefit for profitability. I will claim, and you will see as we go through this, I say, similarly, a social entrepreneur should not adopt the ethics of altruism, which implies sacrifice, but rather an ethics of individualism. So why and how? Let's get into that. The why is because, as individual implies, and I will show and demonstrate, this is in your rational self-interest. The how is through productive achievement. And here's the most important point. The how and why together are achieved by recognizing the social benefits that you wish to offer are actually value propositions. Let me elaborate on this concept of value propositions because it is key to what I'm trying to talk about today. Now, for-profit enterprises in this context all deliver social benefits through the value propositions that they offer. A for-profit company did not deliver products or services of value to society would fail because you, I, all the consumers would not buy from them. And also nonprofit enterprises who do not satisfactorily serve the social causes, they would fail because contributors would no longer donate to their cause. For both of them, these are in fact value propositions they are offering to society as social benefits. Let's go just a little deeper now. Consider even Walmart, who we all know of and I'm sure buy from, as an example of a company offering a value propositions as social benefits, yet producing substantial profits in doing so. Walmart was founded by Sam Walton in 1962, before all you were born, but not me, and is an example of a for-profit company that has provided a normal benefit to society. Clearly, it provides a lot of high products at highly competitive prices. I'm sure you've all been there. I've been there. Yeah, John Tierney states, no institution or agency has done more to help the poor than Walmart. By thus serving society, the Walton family has become the richest family in America with a net worth of $190 billion. I just read this week, however, that had Jeff Bezos stayed married, he would have a net worth as a family of $200 billion and would obviously exceed the Waltons, but it may still yet. Anyway, Walmart is an example of a company delivering social benefits as value propositions. After all, we depend on these businesses to provide all the products and services required for our daily lives on a daily basis, low cost, healthy food. Simply stated, groceries obviously reduce starvation, healthy food improves health, lower prices reduces poverty. However, in the broader context, and this is a historical note you might want to be interested in, Walmart and many other companies like them are simply examples of what the economist Adam Smith stated over 250 years ago in The Wealth of Nations. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. So the why, by Adam Smith's account, as he emphasizes, is regard to their interests. So before we move on to the real challenges, I just want to summarize this point again, that the answer to the ethical challenge, in my mind, you should adopt for social entrepreneurship is in fact individualism, where social benefits are properly viewed as value propositions, how they are created through productive achievement, and why is because it is in the social entrepreneurs your rational self-interest to do so. So with that ethical understanding, let's dig into the real part of this lecture, which is you as entrepreneurs, how this is applied to you, impacts you as an entrepreneur, and your relationship with investors, consumers, government, and society in general, because I do believe you can succeed if you properly understand these challenges. First, let's talk about you as the entrepreneurs, which I assume you all hope to become someday. And this is going to talk about in regard to both your incentive and your motivation for creating a social enterprise. Let's first begin with the incentive, which we talked about previously, the idea that you invest time and money, of course, to make money. Now, why would you do that? Well, as a social entrepreneur, the first issue, or any entrepreneur for them, the first issue you must face is a fundamental and inescapable reality that as an entrepreneur, you're relying on the enterprise as your primary means for earning a living. This is your primary incentive for becoming an entrepreneur. To live, you must eat. To eat, you must work. Now, what does work mean for you as an entrepreneur? It means creating an enterprise that fulfills this fundamental requirement to survive and thrive. I've often seen many entrepreneurs miss this point early on, and I have to remind them of that. Providing a livelihood for yourself through productive achievement is a moral responsibility we all share. Clearly, this is in your rational self-interest, as I stated earlier, to do so. Entrepreneurs, in fact, who fail to provide for themselves can't even provide benefits to anybody else. Now, Andrew Matthews sums this up rather distinctly and concisely when he states, the best thing you can do for the poor is not be one of them. This is from his book on being happy. Let's move on to another impact potentially of your incentive, which I'm sure you've all heard, which is the concept of learn, earn, and return. Tristan Walker kind of sums this up. He sold his company to Procter & Gamble, and he says he wants to spend the first third, he suggests you spend the first third of your life learning, the second earning, and the third returning. He says he likes to shorten the earnings so he can maximize returning. Now let's look at somebody who took this to what I call the irrational extreme end, Zal Krasinski. Zal Krasinski not only felt obligated to return to society the $45 million he earned, he literally donated one of his kidneys to a complete stranger. Now, to me, this is not a concept of forfeiting, as I'm suggesting, but this is literally an altruistic sacrifice of something one values. In this case, literally part of oneself. So the question one might ask, an entrepreneur might rightly ask in response to learn and return is, what have I taken that I need to return? The mantra learn, earn, and return is quite often based on the notion that society provided one's education, allowed one to earn a financial gain, and now can claim that one is obligated to return it to society. Frankly, my response to that is entrepreneurs are not born into this world with a debt to their fellow man they're obligated to repay through a lifetime of involuntary service to others. Everyone benefits from the social institutions and structures that surround us. And we particularly owe a debt to the thinkers and producers that preceded us. However, you as individual entrepreneurs still have to provide the initiative and creativity to make something of it. So to me, is it not in fact more productive for an entrepreneur to adopt the mantra of learn, earn, and not return, but reinvest. This is in fact what many serial entrepreneurs and venture capitalists like myself do. The wealth they create from what they produce may be invested to produce even more. Imagine what Zell could have done if he had applied this principle with the $45 million and had in fact reinvested it. If he was really dedicated to solving kidney disease, he could have donated 10% to the Kidney Foundation. He might have then invested $40 million in research that would have produced some real long-term solutions. And if he'd done so, I hope in fact he would have made yet another fortune, which he could have yet invested in something else. But clearly he did not apply the recommendation of Andrew Matthews that the best thing you can do for the poor is not become one. Instead, in my mind, Zell increased the number of poor by becoming one himself. So one might infer that I'm implying entrepreneurship is about making money. I am not, actually. Which brings me to what actually motivates entrepreneurs and should be most important to you. And that's how entrepreneurs motivation potentially can be undermined when choosing a social enterprise structure if you're not careful. Money is clearly an incentive, but not the source of motivation. As Ayn Rand would say, money is only a tool. It will take you where you wish, but will not replace you as the driver. What concerns me sometimes when I hear social entrepreneurs talk is they will often claim what makes an idea worth pursuing is not because it motivates or benefits you, the entrepreneur, but presumably because it benefits society. That may be taken to imply that the entrepreneur should subordinate their personal vision and motivation to achieve the needs of others. Serving society over serving oneself potentially robs the entrepreneur of the desire and passion and incentive to exercise their creative abilities, which I assume you all have and wish to develop, for the purposes in your joy derived from executing on that vision, to create the products that you believe are of value that will then serve society. The passion of executing on a worthy goal, confident you are capable of achieving it and seeing it through completion is what should motivate an entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur included. Now, let's take an example of that, our famous Steve Jobs. Why did Steve Jobs create the Apple II, which goes back to my day, by the way, the Macintosh, the iPad, and the iPhone? As Steve Jobs said, he created it because he loved doing it. That's what motivated him. He said, if you don't really love it, you will give it up. Moreover, he did not create them because of some deep desire to serve society. As he also stated, your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. It is irrational and altruistic for a social entrepreneur to sacrifice what motivates you to others. Now, let's move on beyond these incentives and motivations, which we just briefly touched on. We could elaborate on them extensively, but we only have so much time and more challenges to cover. And this is potentially a challenge in finding investors, which I can talk about a lot because I have been one. As the Harvard professor, Shkar Ghosh, said, and we all know, 75% of US venture-backed startups fail. And in my experience, even the ones that succeed aren't necessarily highly profitable. So it should be obvious to everyone that investors will naturally shy away from investing in a company founded on the concept of limited profitability. Investors look to invest in companies with the potential to achieve high profitability and a high return on their investment. Now, a lot of people would say, why? They must be wanting to make a killing. But no, that's not in fact the case. And I can attest to this too. They simply are trying to compensate for the many companies they invest in, they lose on. Investors have to make up with one highly profitable company what they lose on with others. There are, of course, investors who invest solely in social enterprises. I could even be claimed to be one myself. However, aligning the social entrepreneur's goals with investors is essential from the start to avoid a conflict and avoid many dangerous challenges. Let's look into one that I'm personally aware of, Habit. Now, here's a story of a company that of what potentially can go wrong when the desires of the founder to forfeit profitability, social purpose, runs into conflict with investors' concept of forfeiting to a social purpose. Habit was a company founded by a marine biologist here in Victoria, you might be interested to know, who initially developed devices for tracking whales for marine research. He was a researcher himself. Eventually, the company produced custom devices for tracking other animals, still primarily for research purposes and research institutions. The company languished for a lot of years as the market for such devices is limited. Most of the products developed, custom tracking devices, have very limited marketing scalability. However, a creative entrepreneur investor joined Habit as the new CEO with a new vision to produce a product to track Alzheimer's patients. Now, if you know anything about Alzheimer's patients, they are prone to wander, get lost, which can in fact even be fatal. The families and institutions that care for these patients, this is a serious problem for them, which actually represents a considerable market for such tracking devices. Now, using the elements of the technology for tracking animals, Habit was clearly in a position to do this, and they did. They, in fact, developed a simple wristwatch-sized tracking device. You may be aware of these now. They were the initial founders of this idea, which Alzheimer's patients wore. With the proof of concept and a good business plan, the CEO obtained additional investment from venture capitalists. The company was successful in developing the product and marketing on a national basis and associated with many nationally recognized Alzheimer's support organizations. Now, all seemed promising with the company until the founder demanded that the languishing animal tracking endeavors be subsidized by the Alzheimer's successful tracking business. Because to him, supporting wildlife research was just as important as making a profit. The investors did not agree. Why? Well, the investors were glad to support a profitable enterprise that benefited and saved human lives, tracking Alzheimer's patients, but they didn't sign up for that. They were not interested in supporting an unprofitable venture that was more of a personal interest to the founder than them. The investors and the CEO, thus representing the primary shareholders and majority board of directors, literally had to split off and sold the Alzheimer's tracking business. The animal tracking business eventually failed. Now, there's more lessons to here than just that simple story. It's important to note there really was nothing wrong with the founder's original motivation, selling animal tracking devices to researchers. He had the expertise, he had the passion, much like you as social entrepreneurs, hopefully. And to him, that was a worthy goal. But originally, he'd wanted to do it as a profitable business. Unfortunately, like many businesses, didn't prove to be successful. But there's nothing altruistic and sacrificial about his attempt to do so. Even the idea for him of forfeiting some profitability, which he would have been willing to do, may not have been altruistic for him as the founder, as he valued animal tracking so highly. And as I'm sure you value many of those social benefits highly, I presume. But it would have been irrational and an altruistic sacrifice to do for the investor to do so, as they did not. And thus the potential conflict. Now, just to extend this a little further, if the founder of Habit had recognized this from the very beginning and created a nonprofit organization to support animal tracking rather than a for-profit company, he might have attracted donors. He might have not have had to find investors who would have wanted to have separate purposes, who would have made him abandon animal tracking and align with their values. Clearly, saving the lives of Alzheimer's patients has significant social benefit, and Habit pursued this as a profitable venture. To the investors, this enterprise delivered a social benefit profitably without sacrifice. It's important to note that quite often some of the social enterprises that you might want might best take this track as well, or you might be willing to forfeit. But it is a clear example of how this can run afoul with investors. Okay, it's not for investors, my area of expertise, but not maybe as interests you. Let's consider some of the challenges, one of many, but an important one as pertains to consumers. Now, throughout all history, entrepreneurs have attributed to human advancement clearly by creating products for consumers that added value through innovation. This is a new area I'm getting into. Many social enterprises, however, attempt to add value not through innovation necessarily, but merely through an addition of a social benefit, which requires some forfeiture, completely even unrelated in many times to the products they are offered and create. As social entrepreneurs, their investors may forfeit profitability, and consumers may forfeit some competitive pricing in support of such enterprises. That's fine. However, solving problems by these means does not equate in my mind to solving them through innovation, which as entrepreneurs should be significant to you. Consider the following two, some of which you may know, because also local BC businesses anyway, that attempt to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide, which many of course seem to want to do these days. 10 Tree and Carbon Cure, and see whether you can discern the essential difference between them and I'm getting to. Let's begin with 10 Tree. Okay, what do they say on their website? At 10 Tree, we empower everyone to plant trees with their purchases while offering sustainably made products for everyone to enjoy. Now, maybe you know these people. They make outdoor clothing from sustainable resources. It's interesting. And oddly enough, for each customer, they plant 10 trees. They even tag the clothing on the 10 trees specific to the ones they're going to plant on your behalf for buying their clothes. And this to me is clearly an example of a social enterprise. They claim as of the end of 2019 to have planted 30 million trees with a goal to plant 1 billion trees by 2030. Obviously to them, the more trees it plants, the more carbon dioxide it will help remove from the atmosphere over time. Interesting. Okay, let's look at the next example, Carbon Cure. Now, what is their claim? That's their value proposition. Carbon Cure is leading a global initiative to reduce the carbon footprint of the built environment using recycled CO2 to improve the manufacturing process of the world's most abundant material, which it is, concrete. How do they do this? Carbon Cure injects carbon dioxide into concrete to strengthen it. This reduces the amount of cement required to achieve the same structural strength, oddly enough, while simultaneously sequestering millions of pounds of CO2 from the atmosphere into concrete. Now, Carbon Cure may seem like a social enterprise. It provides a lot of social benefit, and in many senses you could say that. But to me, it is more of a for-profit company with a financial advantage, with a value proposition that, in fact, delivers a social benefit. Using less cement in concrete saves money and improves profitability for them. As of the end of 2019, Carbon Cure has literally sequestered 113 million pounds of CO2, and their goal is to remove 500 megatons of CO2 per year from the atmosphere. Okay, so much for the background of these two companies. Both companies remove carbon dioxide, or that's their goal. What's the distinguishing difference here? That's important. 10 Tree achieves its goal by removing CO2 by forfeiture. Carbon Cure achieves it through innovation. Now, for 10 Tree, planting trees is a social benefit that is unrelated to the company's product that adds costs, which requires obviously some forfeiture at some point, either on the part of profitability or competitive pricing, or maybe even both. Carbon Cure nonetheless provides the same social benefit as 10 Tree, yet through innovation, forfeiting neither profitability nor competitive pricing. Now, 10 Tree clearly is an example of a social enterprise, and they may well succeed if they find the investors and consumers willing to make forfeitures to support, the social benefits that they're offering. Sustainable colony, planting trees. This is fine. However, it's interesting to note something about this when I looked at them, in that they do use sustainable materials such as hemp, recycled polyester, and even wood fiber. These are all pretty innovative propositions in my mind, which would attract me to them. And obviously, many people believe this has some social benefits, sustainability, something you might want to question me about later on, directly related to the products they sell. Yet oddly enough, 10 Tree seems it necessary to add a social benefit, planting trees, to justify the business that is in fact unrelated to the products. One might question, I would, whether this is potentially whitewashing or greenwashing. I mean, why are they doing this, right? Or potentially indicative, maybe even of an altruistic sacrifice. They believe they should sacrifice to do this. This would be a concern for me as an investor, and I'd want to invest it. I have, in fact, even asked them and never got a reply as to what their real motivations were, so I may never know. But this leads me to the next area of discussion, which is corporate social responsibility. Now, beyond entrepreneurial enterprises such as yourself, I hope you all hope to be someday big enterprises, big successful businesses. Large public corporations, however, are being challenged to adopt policies, which I'm sure you've heard of, corporate social responsibility. Larry Fink of BlackRock manages almost $7 trillion of assets. That's a lot of money in anybody's investment portfolio. Larry says, society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose. Well, does anybody oppose this idea? Let's look at Milton Friedman again, who has clearly an opposite end of the spectrum view on this. He claims speeches by businessmen on social responsibility may gain them kudos in the short run, but it helps to strengthen the already too prevalent view that the pursuit of profits is wicked. Now, it's becoming more common for large corporations to advertise their products with an added social benefit, whether related to the product or not, which is always a bit of a concern to me. As with social enterprises, however, investors and consumers, I grant, may very well share those same values, which can add overall value to the corporation in the marketplace, especially, in my mind, and importantly, if there's some connection to product involved. But in some cases, as I look at it, and I think you should look at it and ask yourself, is this really nothing more than whitewashing or greenwashing? Which to me, if it is, smacks of a lack of honesty and integrity on the part of these companies. As such, supporting unrelated social benefits in this situation effectively represents nothing more than a charitable donation by a corporation, not actually at their expense, but more at the expense of investors and consumers. So why do investors invest in companies? Individuals most often invest to maximize their investments for retirement or other purposes. Some charitable, perhaps not. That's why people invest in companies. A shareholder might rightly ask why their profits are being spent for a social benefit preferred by a board of directors instead of being passed on to them to be spent on their own lives or on the causes they prefer themselves. Consumers, on the other end of the spectrum, might also ask the same question in regards to being charged higher prices, which has to be the case. How does this benefit anyone, yet alone those who may be even too poor to afford them? Now, it can be argued, in my mind, that consumers and investors of individuals should choose their own donations as individuals instead of having them imposed upon them by corporations and their board of directors. This isn't to say, however, that there can't be, large corporations can't provide social benefits by supporting charitable organizations. Sometimes this can provide a significant social benefit that is in fact appropriate. Take the National Football League. They support youth football. Now this is an example of a benefit that they're giving to the sports football provided by them that is directly related to their product, the sport of football. Advancing the sport of football is clearly in the NFL's rational self-interest. It is neither sacrificial nor altruistic, yet provides an enormous benefit for those young people wishing to participate in football. So, to sum this up a little bit, whose decision is it when considering the concept of social responsibility? The question should ask is whether is it a decision a corporation impose on individuals, or more appropriately, whether it's a decision an individual should make for themselves. Obviously, I support individualism, which contends individuals are responsible for all decisions that apply to them. However, I have to say, and I'm sure you know, many suggest it is a decision government should impose on both corporations and individuals, which leads me to the next area of discussion of challenges, your relationship with government. Now, the Harvard Business Review again states, many social enterprises survive only through the largesse of government subsidies, charitable foundations, and a handful of high net worth individuals. Seeking subsidies and grants from government has many dangers, and I have personally experienced myself. I assume most of you would consider it unjust for large corporations, which you hear of all the time, employing corporate cronyism to seek some market advantage by gaining subsidies and regulations preferential to their business. Let's look into this in the energy industry, for example. This is from 2012, but actually the numbers are similar today. Global fossil fuels receive $544 billion per year in subsidies. Similarly, however, renewable energy industry received $212 billion, or in 2012, $101 billion in subsidies. Now ask yourself, are any of these just? For the same reason corporate cronyism is unjust in my mind, it is equally unjust for social enterprises to seek social benefit subsidies from the government. Now, there's several negative potential consequences, many others, but there's two important ones that I want to cover so you understand. First of all, it puts you as the entrepreneur into an arm wrestling contest with large corporations to seek the support of government. If you subscribe to that mechanism, who do you think is going to win that contest? Better to win the minds and hearts, in my mind, of consumers than the arm wrestle with large corporations for government subsidies. Next, more importantly, that which government grants, government can take away, financially ruining a company overnight. I even know of an example of this directly. If anybody wants to ask me about it, I'll elaborate it in more detail later on. Both of these are hazards when one attempts to employ government force to support a business, whether it's social enterprise or not, instead of allowing people to act on their own evaluations as individuals in a free market. Rand obviously has something very important to say about this in terms of this ethical challenge. Everyone has the right to make his own decisions, but none has the right to force his decisions on others. This, I'm afraid, applies even to social entrepreneurs who have no right to force the decisions of what is socially beneficial on anyone, no matter how socially beneficial they claim them to be. Which leads me next to some of the greatest challenge, the challenge you might face in dealing with society itself, the very people social entrepreneurship attempts to benefit. Now consider the following dichotomy in this regard. We all know Bill Gates is considered by many in society as a hero for establishing the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which certainly has benefited millions of people around the world. And with the COVID virus, is working on that as well with hundreds of millions of dollars. But as we all know, and I know personally, because I was in this industry, Bill Gates benefited billions of people through the development of Microsoft. Now, why is this a dichotomy? Bill Gates is not considered a hero for creating Microsoft versus creating the Gates Foundation. But why? Both are examples of individualism, the pursuit of one's own rational self-interest. And while philanthropy may be noble in support of one's values, such as Bill employed, why isn't productive achievement considered equally noble, if not more so, if it benefits billions of people? Again, as Rand says, her philosophy in essence is the concept of man as a heroic being, which is what I started this lecture off by saying. As entrepreneurs, you are heroic people to take on the challenges of the world. But productive achievement is your noblest activity. Now, here's something even more surprising we need to move on to, is that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, even serving the millions of people they do with their foundation, are often criticized for giving only to charities people say they deem worthwhile. Now, this is strange to me. It implies that one must sacrifice not only to give to the particular foundation, but even the choice of it. Now, this is, to me, is an altruistic principle in the extreme. Unfortunately, Bill Gates sanctions such things when he makes public statements such as, we saw it early, reducing inequity is the highest human achievement. A responsibility to give back to society is also that. This is what is referred to by Ayn Rand as a sanction of the victims. What she would claim is it's a moral crime to support one's destroyers. Society may attempt to make victims of you as entrepreneurs, but you should never sanction it. So let's sum it up a bit here. I've discussed some of the challenges as an entrepreneur, just a few. There are many others, and I'm glad to share and talk those with you as well. In regards to their incentive and motivation as an entrepreneur, I've covered some of the challenges in your relationship with investors, consumers, government, and society. That's fine. But hopefully, more importantly, I've provided you with a way to meet those challenges, with an answer to the ethical question being individualism, which we've covered, where social benefits are properly viewed as value propositions you're bringing to the market like everyone else. And you're creating them through a productive achievement, hopefully through innovation as well as creative entrepreneurs. And the reason why is because it's in your rational self-interest to do so. So I'll leave you with this final closing challenge. Throughout the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads armed with nothing but their own vision. Social entrepreneurship, to me, can be an appropriate vehicle for an entrepreneur to achieve that vision. Pursuing your vision, however, should be viewed as singly sufficient and as noble and ethical a goal as any of you as entrepreneurs could strive for or hope to achieve. And as an entrepreneur, you should proudly announce the ethical value of pursuing your ideas for their own benefit, again, through productive achievement without further justification required. So, as promised, I suspect in the beginning of my lecture, this has challenged some of your religious thinking, at least giving you some pause to consider. Well, that I'll end there and give you the chance to challenge me with your questions, which I'm sure you will. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, John, for such an enlightening lecture. I truly appreciate the critical lens. And I know you've given us a lot to think about, so that's great. So with that in mind, let's open it up for questions. So if you do not wish to have your sound recorded today, go ahead and use the chat and I'll read those out loud for John. Otherwise, just raise your blue hand and we'll do about 15 minutes of Q&A. Bazad, go for it.
We also have the one question that was already written in, but fine.
Oh, right, yes, we'll address that one as well.
Go for it.
Hey, thank you, John, so much for your presentation. I found it really interesting how you kind of legitimize how when people do productive achievement, it should be acknowledged as well. I'm curious, do you get pushback when you present these ideas to other demographics? Do they kind of push you back? And if they do, how do they do so? What do you respond to people who don't agree with what you're saying?
Well, do I get pushback from a lecture like this? Oh, absolutely. I would say, in fact, more than not. And but you know, there's only one response to it. You first of all acknowledge and validate their ideas because they have some good ideas, right? But you simply apply reason. So I always ask why, right? And I hope one of you will ask the question, which is the $64,000 question, which underpins this, is like, why not sacrifice? What's wrong with that? We were raised on that idea, right? I was raised on that idea. When I was your age, that is the ethic that I employed. I'm sure I was even more progressive than most of you. But if you ask the question why, and allow them to explain, and say, what is your reasoning? You'll find often they do not have as good a reason as you might imagine. So yeah, I get a lot of pushback. In fact, I'm expecting some here and now. Do you have a question that might be that way? I'm glad you like the idea of productive achievement, by the way. That's a biggie.
I personally don't have too much pushback because, like, as a pragmatic approach, I kind of understand everything that you're saying. So that's why I was wondering what common things are that people say.
Well, most people, I've already announced one. Most people say, well, what's wrong with sacrifice? I mean,
Yeah.
I've been raised with that, and I'd be glad to answer that. A lot of people say, wow, this doesn't sound very kind or caring, and I'd be glad to answer that one as well. A lot of people I have, in fact, one person wrote a question as well, you know, how do you prioritize, you know, ESG and TV, triple bottom line and so on? You know, I could answer that, but, you know, I guess I'd have to. A lot of people say, well, who's Ayn Rand? What's that all about? Where these ideas come from? And of course, I could answer that. Or common goods, sustainability, you know. So yeah, let's get into some of those ideas. I'd love to answer that.
Yeah, actually, John, that was going to be the next question from Jamal. He actually wanted to ask it to you. So go ahead, Jamal.
Okay, yeah, thanks, John. I really found this very interesting. So I was the one who wrote in the question. So yeah, just kind of your thoughts on around ESG and triple bottom line, and specifically how you prioritize them, because I've worked for investment firms where they prioritize the governance or they prioritize the sustainability or environmental factors. So I was wondering how you factor that into your investment decisions. And then I kind of have a follow-up question after you get into that.
Sure. I'm glad you wrote that question in. Gave me a chance to prepare in advance. Thank you for that. Okay. Of course, ESG stands for environment, social governance. TBL stands for triple bottom line, which I talked about, people, planet, and profit. So my response to your question, what are you looking for as an investor in regard to this? Well, maybe you already know the answer from listening to my lecture. And the following would be, what is the ESG and TBL value proposition you as an entrepreneur are proposing to enhance the value of the business? Are these values in your rational self-interest? I mean, are these values that you have that you really support? Are they in alignment with my values as an investor, such as the problem with habit? Are these values in alignment with what customers value? For an example, I was in fact the investor in habit I was talking about. I believe Alzheimer's tracking patients offered tremendous social benefits, and like common curve could be achieved through innovation and be highly profitable. So it's not correct to say that I prioritize an ESG or TBL per se, and I don't think most investors do. As an entrepreneur and investor myself, I pursued my vision and my values because I wanted to and assumed that I could. And thus, that was in my rational self-interest to do so. I assumed, of course, it would be a benefit to others. I assumed the Alzheimer's track would be a benefit to a lot of people, which it was. But like Steve Jobs, I didn't do it for anybody else or in accordance with any really ESG or TBL priorities per se. If you have any value propositions based on some aspect of ESG or TBL that provides some both social benefit that you value and think investors and customers will value, as well, then by all means execute on it, right? But do it because you value and you want to, and you think you can succeed with others as well, which ultimately is because it's in your interest to do so. Now, add on to this, just one final subtle point in this regard is how I would prioritize, in asking me, how would I prioritize this, is that you shouldn't begin there. It's about your priorities first. You just as you shouldn't subordinate your vision to society, you shouldn't subordinate it to investors either. Seek out investors that support your vision, not the other way around. That's how I would answer that question. What's your follow-up question?
Thank you. That was a great answer. And it did answer a little bit of parts of my follow-up question, but I was just kind of looking for some clarity then around what you think in terms of interpersonal values and then company values in terms of alignment. So
sure,
I'd like
to answer that. Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Sorry,
so now go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, sorry. I just wanted to add on, like with the BlackRock example, and even if you look like organizations like JP Morgan that are capitalist by nature, they have values and then they also make money for their shareholders. So as an investor, when you look into that, you could say, well, they're capitalist by nature, but if I take my investments and JP Morgan gives to philanthropy and BlackRock gives to philanthropy, how do you separate the two and kind of your values along those lines?
Well, yeah. So now we're getting a little bit into terms of like, what are my values, which maybe aren't of any interest to anybody, versus like what are global values, because it's individual, right? Everybody has their own values and how they associate. Personally, I tell you how I associate my values. People, to me, I value human flourishing in all aspects of human flourishing. And so I always look on what is the impact of this investment and this business going to be on the health, wealth, and well-being of people. That quite often runs a bit afoul of people who say, oh, no, you should sacrifice health, wealth, and well-being of people, perhaps to the environment or some other thing. And that that's me, right? I mean, I have friends of mine, the co-investor is a friend of mine in Carbon Cure. He's all about the environment, right? That's his whole his whole interest. So fine, you know, that's it. So whether it's me or anybody, I think the important thing is, what is the value proposition that you're making to the investor, and what is the investor's view of that value proposition? That's the proper way to look at it. Me, it's human flourishing. Me, it's Alzheimer's patients, saving human lives. That's me.
Great, thank you. Jamal, are you okay? Do you have any other follow-up questions?
We can talk after too.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I will ask afterwards. Thank you.
Great. Awesome. So we'll move on to Zenon in the interest of time, and then there's a question by Alessandra as well. So Zenon, you go first.
For sure. Thanks, John. So my question was just, I found it very insightful, your approach to kind of analyzing Tentree and their business model with giving back, and how it kind of removes that option from the consumers themselves. And I was just wondering if you had any more examples of businesses that are doing, or that are using innovation as a way of giving back, like that cement company that you mentioned. If there's any other companies that kind of come to mind as a way of like being a good example of how they incorporated innovation as a method of like furthering their cause that they believe in.
Oh gosh. Well, you see, you know, I mean, obviously the Alzheimer's one, right? I mean, that's the one I personally was involved in. Personally, though, the way I like to look at that is that, you know, I think you all go all the way back to the value proposition concept I talked about with Walmart and everybody. Literally, in my mind, all companies should be considering the value proposition they offer as being socially beneficial. I think the Waltons, even as wealthy as they are, do it that way. I mean, they are trying to create, you know, low cost, healthy food available to everybody. So the Aldi's is another company that's exactly the same model. All of these people are trying to provide some social benefit. If they didn't, nobody would buy from them. Nobody would want them. So, you know, how you decide what that benefit is. So they probably consider that a perfectly socially beneficial as anything else. So the fact that Carbon Cure might be addressing something that people consider to be like removing carbon dioxide, something that you obviously, I am implying in value, is why you're selecting it. But that's what you should be doing. You should be looking at what you value and aligning yourself with companies or people that you value. So yeah, I mean, I only consider companies that offer value, period. I mean, I wouldn't invest in a company that's some losing proposition right off the box. It's not going to be around and can't do any benefit to anybody. So I don't sort of, you know, and I have my values of what that might mean, but you know, that's all the way along that spectrum, right? I don't, and if I really value it, I mean, for example, I mean, here's a really good example. Why am I here, right? Am I making a fortune giving this lecture? Not at all. I don't get paid anything. Why? Because I value this. I value teaching students like you, as do your teachers. So, I mean, that's way on the left end of the spectrum, right? So, and yet I invest in totally for-profit companies, you know, developing good products to the market and so on. So that's the better way to look at it, in my mind. Hopefully I've answered your question.
Interesting. Thank you, John. So we do have one last hand up, but before we go to Alessandra, I received a question on the chat. So the student says, hi, Sarah. John briefly mentioned how the government would sometimes take money back from a business and how the outcome of this could really impact a business negatively. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on this, such as when and why this would happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I have an acquaintance of mine, from was way back, by the way, because I'm an old timer, who invested in renewable energy based on a business model in California. You may know all the wind turbines that are in California. They have a lot of them down there. He was the first person to develop and invest in wind farms in Southern California. And his monetizing plan was based on the concept of you could backfeed the grid, right, and get paid for it. That was a law. It was set up under the law. You could do it, and you could even do that today if you're an individual. Well, he said, wow. He was an MIT professor, brilliant guy. He said, oh, wow. He wanted to solve the energy crisis of the 70s, which you weren't around, but I was, when they had embargoes on oil. And he said, we're going to build wind farms. He built a company in a relatively short period of time with a value in those days of $350 million, right, on wind farms, backfeeding the grid. Well, that was based on the government regulation, allowed them to backfeed the grid and get paid for it. Well, they didn't like the idea of having to pay that much money at those rates. So they changed the rates literally overnight. They said, oh no, we're not going to pay those rates. We pay some little guy, but not you. No, that's not right. He literally went bankrupt in 90 days from $350 million to zero. Zero. So this is why I always say I would never, ever invest in a business that was supported by government grants or subsidies. And the reason is subsidies that can be granted can be just as quickly withdrawn, and you can go bankrupt overnight. You can bankrupt overnight. Hopefully that answers your question.
Very interesting. Thank you, John. Yes, one last question, and then we'll move on to the informal networking time. And if you had a question for John and didn't get a chance to ask, you can always stick around afterwards and ask them directly. Yes. So, Alessandra, would you like to ask your question?
So yeah, you kind of create an image where this world is just entrepreneurs providing value for these other people. But we know that there are governments that may restrict this and have regulations and, like you say, disincentivize innovation. But you speak a lot about Ayn Rand as well. And Ayn Rand talks about individual rights and political freedom. And where do you think the government would come in its role in adding value to its citizens? So say with subsidies, if a company could acquire subsidies from the government as opposed to investors, would that potentially not be beneficial?
Okay, I think I'm understanding your question, which is like, what is the role of government potentially in helping businesses, maybe through subsidies or something of that nature? Is like, what is the proper role of government? Well, I mean, the proper role of government, certainly from the Ayn Rand's perspective and my perspective, is to protect the rights of individuals in order to engage in free enterprise in the market, right? Without, in fact, government involvement. So this really is a discussion of which is capitalism, right? I mean, what is the role of capitalism? What is capitalism? Because a lot of people will see, a capitalist and capitalism is the lying, cheating, stealing, greedy buggers, right? And I actually know such people, by the way. They call themselves capitalists. In fact, I think we might even agree one of them can even become president, perhaps. And I don't consider that a capitalist, and I don't consider that the appropriate role of government. Under capitalism, the idea is that people are free to exchange in the market economically. So it's both an economic concept and it's a political concept. Politically, under capitalism, the idea is that without government intervention. So anytime you introduce the concept of government subsidies, that means that you are creating an introduction of decided by politicians who maybe are bought through corporate cronyism to influence and distort the market. So I see no role whatsoever, none, by which that should be appropriate, because that's again applying the principle of, you get to make your decisions and you're trying to impose them on others, no matter how socially beneficial you might believe they be. And I'm 100% behind you if you are. But to the idea that you can impose those on others and through the useful coercion in government, no, that's a problem. I have a problem for that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, great. So that concludes our Q&A for now. So again, if you would like to still interact with John and ask us additional questions, feel free to stick around for informal networking time. But for now, I would like to thank you, John, for such an enlightening and engaging lecture. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and so it's a process, right? And I really do appreciate that. And on behalf of the University of Victoria, the Peter B. Gustavson School of Business, as well as the Entrepreneurship team, I'd like to thank you for being so generous with your time and with sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us today. We do actually have a small token of our appreciation for your time. And you can see it here. Usually in the traditional classroom setting, we actually hand it to you. Today we'll have to do it digitally, so just keep an eye on your email. So
class, I have my Gustavson hat. I got a Gustavson hat the last time.
Okay, that's good to know.
and I have a cup too.
Oh, perfect. So it won't be either one of those.
Oh, good. Something
Okay,
new.
good.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, class, would you please join me in giving John a very warm thank you for all the time that he spent with us today. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Okay, I will stop the recording now.